Asia bagged a good number of inscriptions on UNESCO's World Heritage Site list this year. Korea, Japan, Singapore, China and Mongolia all had sites named. Among them were Meiji-era industrial sites in Japan, but not before Seoul lifted its opposition to the listing, arguing some of the factories had used forced labor from South Korea. The matter was settled in the wording and a commitment by Japan to remember the victims. Let's discuss some of the more political angles of UNESCO's World Heritage lists. In the studio with me is Stephen Lansing from NTU's College of Science. He's been involved in assessing Bali heritage sites for UNESCO. And in London we have consultant Chris Blanford, and representing UNESCO for the Asian Pacific, Feng Jing joins us from Paris. Let's start by talking about the Meiji-era restoration sites. Concessions were given by Japan in the negotiations. This was a point of contention. How can wheeling and dealing like this not compromise a judgment on the site's value and its place in history?
I think the reason this often works is that the decisions are actually made by an organization called ICOMOS. And ICOMOS is a private body. It's experts in these fields. They make a recommendation based on the merits of the case, the outstanding universal value, and then that goes to UNESCO. And finally, the decision is made by ambassadors, but on the basis of that reasoned judgment, I would say.
Jing, what would you say about this? Because there was controversy. These sites were meant to highlight the Meiji restoration period where Japan industrialized, but yet during the World War II period, there were sites for forced labor of Koreans, POWs, as well as Chinese. What did ICOMOS come to UNESCO recommending, and then how did you implement that?
I think you need to, as Steve just mentioned, in the World Heritage System, the International Council on Monuments and Sites, it's an advisory body to the World Heritage Committee, where the decision for inscription or the deferral, referral or non-inscription is made by the intergovernmental body called the World Heritage Committee. This committee is composed of 21 members or independent countries in a sense. So the ICOMOS role is to provide its expert recommendations to the World Heritage Committee so that the committee, to enable the committee to make a judgment and also a final decision on those nominations. In this particular case, it was ICOMOS who evaluated the dossier, because normally the countries will submit the dossier to the UNESCO World Heritage Center, which is the secretariat to the World Heritage Committee. So the function of this secretariat is to facilitate the evaluation process. And of course, in the case that we encourage the countries concerned to get a dialogue also on the dossiers in question.
Now, Chris, you've been a consultant on the successful bid for the Botanic Gardens in Singapore. Do you think that it would be worth it to have some kind of judicial review for UNESCO World Heritage Sites? We've seen where in Thailand, in Cambodia, that the Preah Vihear Temple has become a bone of contention between the two nations, especially the skirmishes along the border.
I think that a judicial review is maybe a heavy hammer. I would rather see a much more careful amount of work done at the beginning of the process when, as Steve mentioned earlier, outstanding universal value is taken apart to establish whether the site has particular significance. And because this is world value we're talking about, and because the world is full of good things as well as conflicts, then there will always be uncomfortable parts to it. So even in the Singapore Botanic Garden, which was also a place where prisoners of war were forced to do things by the Japanese, the physical assets that resulted from that are in fact celebrated as part of the World Heritage Site dossier and document. And the management plan calls for the conservation of those. So I think it needs more attention early on, and with great respect to ICOMOS, it's actually the front where that work is done, right at the beginning of the process, which is technical and analytical work, and yes, judgmental work, that's where this begins. And I know it becomes politically difficult later. I've tackled many sites where politics has got in the way. Indeed, it did to some degree in the Singapore one for a while. But part of the exercise of a management plan, which is the working document that takes a World Heritage Site into the future, is to be the catalyst for better communication of and engagement with stakeholders to make sure that everybody is signed up. So even if it takes longer, and politics sometimes makes that necessary, then it's worth working hard to get sign-up from the stakeholders. It's worth working hard to get the community support that's needed, rather than just earn the badge and celebrate that.
Very interesting points there. Stephen, do you agree with that? And talk me through what that looks like to make those assessments and do that research from the front end. You've been involved with World Heritage Sites in Bali. Is that something that has been a part of the process for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Indonesia had tried several times to get a World Heritage in Bali, and UNESCO kept saying, Bali is perfect, it's ideal, because there's this ancient system of managing the natural resources that's still intact. But on the other hand, the island is in danger of being loved to death by all those millions of tourists. So you can see the regions that are still controlled by the people, which are spectacular, wonderful, magical places, and then the places where that control is stopped and it's eroding, it's eroding this magnificent civilization. Mm-hmm. So the plan is very simple, and Bali could easily become the prime example of a successful case in Asia. All that is really needed is implementing the management plan, which hands over control to the people, to the elected representatives of the villages. That system has existed for centuries in Bali, and it's basically ready to go. So it's going to be interesting to see how well that works out in Bali, but it could really be the solution to the problem of mass tourism, allowing the local people to control it, to manage it. There are lots of ways that could be done, and in Bali, the willpower, the infrastructure is already there, kind of waiting to go.
Jing, there are times when UNESCO has spoken out about developments and other, say, archaeological activities in World Heritage Sites. I'm talking specifically about Jerusalem's Old City. That has angered some Israeli officials that they've said something about it. Is that something that happens often with UNESCO? Do you comment about things that happen after awarding a World Heritage Site?
Now, I think the case just mentioned doesn't relate specifically to World Heritage, and this is the issue being discussed at the UN Security Council, at different platforms across the UN. I think the specific case on Jerusalem for World Heritage is that the committee also review the state of conservation of the property, because this also been part of the process, process for World Heritage conservation. So there are other issues like the political factor and also other elements, which is also more and more often reviewed in the World Heritage process. The case you mentioned about Privy here, and also other cases like Kosovo and the current case of the Jerusalem. I think these are the sort of similar forms of the sites facing different situations.
And Jing, would you say that there are checks and balances in this system that will help UNESCO avoid any controversies going into the future?
Yeah, I think, as I said, because the spirit of this convention is to encourage international cooperation. So by its Articles 6 to 7, in the sense that in our jargon, the states parties or the member states, to ensure the collective protection of sites of outstanding universal value. So for that purpose, I think the other issues, if we can really ensure proper engagement with the communities, as the other colleagues mentioned, with different stakeholders, I think the issue should be solved in a more peaceful and also more agreeable manner.
Well, let's hope so. A big thank you to all of my guests, Feng Jing from UNESCO, Stephen Lansing from NTU, and Chris Blanford in London. Thank you very much indeed for being on the show. Well, that's it for this edition of Between the Lines. We leave you with a reminder that this and past shows are available online at channelnewsasia.com/video. See you next time.